Good evening, one and all. It's an honor and a privilege to have Matt Grain here with us at New York University in Washington, D.C. It's so rare that we get the opportunity to have a scholar. I mean, right, I'm a practitioner, I play academician, but someone who's a full professor at the Catholic University of America who has been to one of my favorite places. I'm a native Californian, as you know. He is a banana slug, which means he went to the University of California at Santa Cruz. He got his master's and his PhD at Yale University and has written a really interesting book, which I'm so psyched to have had the opportunity to read. And me being an author, I'm not going to lie to you, Matt, I brought my Sharpie so you can sign it, because that's what authors do. But we want to talk about the 50th Speaker of the House of Representatives. And when we talk about the American presidency and we talk about the interplay between the Article 1 and Article 2, I think it's important for you to hear from someone who has really taken a deep dive in what the speaker's role is, what this speaker's role was, and how does that portend as we had 20-something days off to a midterm election of, will Nancy Pelosi give up the gavel, or will Kevin McCarthy take it, or will she keep it? So without further ado, I am so honored and so pleased to welcome to our class, Matt Grain.
Thank you very much. And I want to say, for those who haven't read Ron's book, Black in the White House, there's a scene where he is challenging a prominent historian, Stephen Ambrose, on his facts. Oh, yes. So I know that you will not be afraid to let me know if there's something in this book that I get wrong. But I am looking forward to this conversation. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And one of the things, Tom is hiding in the back, that I brought, which I showed Matt when we came in. So back when I had hair, back when, I was younger, this photograph was taken on the last day that Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House of the United States House of Representatives. And he signed it. And it's been in my basement, it's been in my closet. And I want to show this and share this with you. But let's just open it up. Who is Newt Gingrich?
Who is Newt Gingrich? Well, one of the things that my co-author, Jeff Crouch at American University, and I start the book with is sort of laying out the fact that there hasn't been a consensus in the answer to that question, not only among scholars, but among practitioners and journalists. There's different views of what Gingrich is. For some people, he was this transformative figure that just changed American politics fundamentally. For others, he was just doing what his party wanted him to do. He wasn't really all that remarkable. And then, of course, a lot of the stuff that's written about Gingrich in the popular press is either sensationalistic or very critical, right? It's, Gingrich did this horrible thing, he did that horrible thing. So what Jeff and I were trying to do in the book is approach the subject of Gingrich from a more neutral perspective, right? Who was he? What did he do? And how can we conceptualize his leadership in Congress, not just as Speaker, but from the moment he was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1978. And what we argue in the book is that he was a kind of entrepreneur, specifically a party entrepreneur. So, some members of Congress are institutional entrepreneurs. They want to change the rules of the chamber. Others are policy entrepreneurs. They want to get new bills enacted. But Gingrich was focused on party, and in particular on the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. How can that party, which had been in the minority for many, many years,
40 years.
Yeah, by the time that the 1994 elections came around, how can they become a governing party? And that was his motive. That was one of his most important motives as a member of Congress.
So what Matt would tell you is that Newt Gingrich, Congressman Gingrich, was a backbencher, right? I mean, he was in the back. He took down a former Speaker of the House, a gentleman by the name of Jim Wright. But how did Newt Gingrich go from being a backbencher to being in the front part of the bench?
So there's a series of events that Jeff and I outline in the book that gradually propelled Gingrich to greater and greater prominence, first in Congress and then nationally. We can come back to this a little bit later. On more than one occasion, those things were actually not just what he was doing, but what his allies were doing, and also what the Democratic Party, the governing party, was doing, often unintentionally helping Gingrich increase his profile and his power as a result. One of the early events that really propelled Gingrich to a greater to be in the spotlight was an event in May 1984, which we can talk more about. But basically, he and his allies in the Republican Party were challenging the Democrats, saying, you guys abuse the rules, you guys are abusing power, and then specifically, too many of you are sympathetic to communists, particularly communists in Central America. And it led to this confrontation on the House floor with then Speaker Tip O'Neill, who had a bit of a temper.
That's a polite way of putting it. Yes.
And he basically was upset with the way Gingrich had accused Democrats on the House floor of being allies or sympathetic to communists, and basically said, when you did that, Gingrich, it's the lowest thing I'd seen in my 32 years in Congress. And that violates the rules of the House. You can't do that. And so his words were taken down, which was it's not like he had to, leave Congress for a day, or, it was a slap on the wrist, but it was.
Explain what words taken down are for the students. I mean, you and I both know it, but it's.
Sure, right. So, to keep Congress relatively civil, you are not supposed to do certain things on the House floor, in particular, attacking the character of other members or their motivation. You're supposed to keep things civil, and you are supposed to direct your comments to whoever is chairing, if it's the committee of the whole or the speaker at the time. You're not supposed to directly talk to other members. And O'Neill just lost his cool and basically was pointing at Gingrich, saying, what you did is the lowest thing I've ever seen. And that is a violation of the rules of the House. And that just doesn't happen. Speakers don't do that. So when that happened, all of a sudden, everything stopped, and the press said, wow, what made O'Neill do something so foolish? Oh, it's this guy, Newt Gingrich. And they kind of knew about him, but this got national attention. It was in all the network news. It was in the national papers. And all of a sudden, a lot of people are hearing about this fellow Newt Gingrich for the first time, saying, who is this person? And particularly conservatives, Republicans who were tired of the Democrats, tired of the sense that they were being abused by the governing party. Here's someone who's willing to stand up to Tip O'Neill and Democrats and actually get them in trouble. I mean, it was a minor thing in a way, but that was one of those things that really launched or really propelled his public career.
And this is something I would say to all of you, that it's so important if you want a career in politics and you want to engage, that you've got to know parliamentary procedure. And this is exactly what Matt's talking about of, I want his words taken down. And most members of Congress don't have any idea what that means and the ramifications of it. But let's move beyond 1984. Let's get into the early 90s, if you will. And how is it that this backbencher, this relatively unknown at this point, Matt, person galvanized the support of the Republican minority and found a way to say, I'm the leader and I want to be your next Speaker of the House? How did, Congressman Gingrich do that?
So, before you get to the 90s, but after the 1984 event on the House floor, a couple of big things happened. One, as you mentioned, is that you had a Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, who Gingrich saw as one of the greatest threats to the Republicans because he was very savvy and aggressive, ended up resigning from the House amid a series of charges by the, I remember it was the ethics committee, but basically there's these ethics charges. And
tell us about this. So he had written a book, I guess it was, and that brought him down from allegedly violating the ethics rules.
well, there were a number of sort of, shady's maybe not the right word, but somewhat questionable things that he had done. One of them was he had written this book, and I think the royalty rate on his book was like 50%.
I wish mine was.
Yeah, me too. 50%. So there's these little things that maybe aren't necessarily illegal, but sort of call into question the ethics of the speaker. And Gingrich had almost really by himself said, I'm going to take down the speaker, and was saying things he's the most corrupt speaker we've ever had. And other Republicans, including his allies at the time, were saying, Newt, you don't really have evidence for this. Be careful. You take on the speaker and you fail, you're going to go down.
You're going to go down.
But for various, basically Gingrich is very good at using sort of taking the media, knowing they wanted to hear about these kinds of things, and saying, you know what I just heard about, right? Da, 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 da. And then a story would be written. And then he'd use that story and say, see, someone wrote this story. Now there's another story, and sort of build this momentum. And what's happening at the same time is Wright and other Democratic leaders are really clamping down on the rights of Republicans in the House, because the House is a majoritarian institution. So the majority writes the rules and they enforce the rules. And they were using them to make it harder and harder for Republicans to amend bills, to get their legislation on the floor. And they're getting frustrated. So here's this guy, Newt Gingrich, saying Wright is bad, Wright is bad. And as the story's starting to stick, more Republicans are saying, you know what, we've got to take out Jim Wright, because he is just he's just unfair. So eventually Wright does resign, and Gingrich is seen as the giant killer. He's the one who brought down Jim Wright. And that helps him enormously, not just with fellow conservatives or activists, but even moderates in the party, because they're saying, you know what, we're tired of this too. We're tired of the way we're being treated. And here's someone who we don't agree with ideologically necessarily, but he's willing to fight the Democrats. And then, around the same time, actually a little bit before, because of these activities that Gingrich has been doing, he's elected whip by a very narrow vote, 89 to 87. So now he's in leadership. So by mid-1989, he is no longer a backbencher. He's a whip, and he brought down the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So at that point, he is really kind of, we call it the chapter, so he becomes like an entrepreneurial insider as opposed to an outsider.
Explain to the class what a whip is. What does the whip do?
Sure. So the parties in both the House and Senate have a structure, and the folks in the party structure have different responsibilities. So the whip is really responsible for building majorities, for getting folks to vote together in the party, and also just for counting heads to say, oh, well, do we have the votes to pass this bill or amendment? And so it's a job that requires very good counting skills. It also requires good ability to persuade. You need to know how to get people to change their minds. The assumption when they hear the word whip is they think of an actual physical whip, or they think of the TV show House of Cards, which featured a whip.
I was an extra in several episodes.
Really? I didn't know that. I'm going to have to go watch it again.
I'll have to send you the link to that. It's kind of funny.
Okay, please do. So no, whips don't murder people. Okay. That I remember Kevin McCarthy once said, they asked him, is House of Cards accurate? He said, if I could murder people, I'd be the best whip in ever. Right? I can't do that.
Right, but you can't do that.
You can't do that. So, so the whip's position is important, though. It's a key person in leadership. And Gingrich, being whip, is basically second in command behind the minority leader, Bob Michel. I would note that Gingrich was not actually the most skilled at counting votes. That wasn't his strong suit, as we learned right when he became speaker. But so what he was really good at is messaging. So he created a parallel part of the whip structure led by a congressman named Steve Gunderson, who was in charge of the messaging side of things. So for Gingrich, it wasn't just counting votes. It was also creating and crafting a Republican message and getting it out there repeatedly to help voters see how the Republican Party was different from and better than the Democratic Party.
So let's go back, if we will, before we get into Newt in the 90s, and let's talk about the institution of the speakership of the House. How important do you think it is? How powerful is the Speaker of the House, and what does the Speaker of the House actually do?
So the Speaker of the House, you should start by saying, is mentioned in the Constitution. It's one of the only officers in the congressional officer that's mentioned in the Constitution. So right off the bat, the Speaker has a certain degree of authority that other positions don't. There's no mention of a whip or deputy whip or any of these in the Constitution. So the Speaker his position is very vague in the Constitution. It just says in Article 1, Section 8, the House shall choose its Speaker. So what's happened over the course of 200 plus years is it evolved from a more parliamentarian position, like you see in the House of Commons, where you're just presiding and making sure the rules are being followed, to a position that is in charge of, basically you're in charge of all that. You're the leader of, you're sort of the figure, the head of Congress. You're the top ranked person in the House of Representatives, but you're also, because you're usually chosen, almost always chosen by your party, the majority party, you're also the leader of your party. So you're in charge of helping set the agenda, of helping folks get elected, of interfacing with the White House, particularly if it's the same party president, trying to build a common agenda, get legislation enacted. There's a whole host of things that speakers are responsible for.
And one thing that I think will surprise many of you that Matt will tell you, do you have to be an elected member of Congress to be the Speaker?
Technically, no. There are legal scholars that say, as a practical matter, you can't really be a Speaker if you're not a member of Congress, but there's nothing about that in the Constitution at all. So and this has happened now for the last 10 years because Speaker races, the parties have become more divided on these elections for Speaker, which is held on the House floor, and everybody votes openly, and you can vote for whomever you want. So you see votes for Colin Powell, you see votes for former members, see members voting for each other, and it's usually a protest vote, but yeah, in theory, you could have a coalition that says, Ron Christie, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
I kind of like that title, to be honest with you, but it'll never happen. So let's go now from the 80s, and now let's go to 1994, right? So 1994, I'm embarrassed to tell you how young I was, so I won't say this, but I was quite green behind the ears, and I was working for a backbencher member of Congress by the name of John Kasich from the 12th Congressional District of Ohio, who was one of Speaker Gingrich's lieutenants. And they came up with this idea of the contract with America. Can you share with us what the contract with America is?
Certainly. And before I do, I want to give a little background to this. So the idea that a minority party in Congress would have an agenda that they would present to voters before an election was not something you saw very often in American history. And Gingrich actually first kind of tried to put that idea, which is what the contract was. It's basically like, this is what we'll do if we get elected. He first tried this back in 1980, where he said to other Republicans, hey, this guy Ronald Reagan is our nominee. Let's all go to the Capitol steps. Let's all be as a group. Everyone will see what the Republican Party stands for. They'll vote for us down, up and down the ticket, trying to nationalize the election. It got almost no coverage. There was one little story in the Washington Post. Democrats made fun of it. Reagan showed up, but he didn't want to commit to anything because he wanted to get elected. He didn't think it would be a good idea. So it just kind of died. But Gingrich never gives up this dream of having a kind of platform. And he comes back to it over and over again. Finally, in early 1994, I think it was in Salisbury, Maryland. I thought there was a retreat.
Yeah.
Gingrich at this point, so you have Bill Clinton is the president, okay? You're in what they call the deep minority. You're the Republican Party, you're the minority in the House of Representatives, your party's the minority in the Senate. But the party at this point has so many folks who agree with Gingrich or are willing to go along with his ideas that he doesn't have to fight so many Republicans as he did back in the late 70s, early 80s, saying, what are you doing? This isn't going to work. You have Republicans saying, yeah, you know what? Let's be a team. We're team players. Being a team is how we're going to stop the Democrats. And there's this retreat held in Maryland with a number of members of Congress and staff. And they're there to kind of help talk about and talk through what could we all agree upon. as a party, which is not an easy exercise to do.
No.
I wish I've read about it. I've read memos from there. I wish I could have been there to see it. And there's certainly some Republicans saying, I don't know if this is going to work. What are we going to do? But starting from that retreat, you have basically a series of steps taken. Folks like Dick Armey, who was a prominent Republican, House Republican at the time, sort of helping develop specific things that Republicans could agree upon that would become their platform. And then fast forward to September, when it's released in the Capitol steps. This time, Gingrich has gotten, basically almost every Republican running for Congress, incumbent or challenger, to sign this contract. Mm-hmm. And they put it in TV Guide, they put it in Reader's Digest. They've got this big rollout, and they're basically saying, here's the 10 things that we will vote on if you give us power in the House. These are things Democrats never let us vote on. These are things you like. They had done, testing to see what was popular. And guess what? If we don't meet our promise and vote on these, kick us out in 1996. And it was a pretty remarkable event. It still wasn't clear if it was going to work. A lot of Democrats made fun of it. Some said, well, now we can attack you, right? So now, you're going to do this. How are you going to do that? But when Republicans win control of the House of Representatives, and I was working in the House at the time, as were you, so it was a remarkable event to have this election. From that point on, members of Congress are saying, "Oh, that's what you got to do. That's what you've got to do. You've got to have a promise. You've got to have a contract." And for every 2 years, for many years, that's what the minority party does, and that's what Kevin McCarthy and Republicans are doing again with consultation with Gingrich, is this platform.
Isn't it fascinating that the new is the old and the old is the new? And exactly, I think so Kevin McCarthy was a staffer who was working for Bill Thomas, who was, the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, who, when my car broke down in the parking lot across the street, was underneath my car. And now to think that he's on the verge of being the new Speaker of the House. But it's just bizarre. But let's talk about 94. Why do you think that worked? Why do you think that the Republicans having been out of power for 40 years? And I would say this to you, Republicans were out of power for 40 years for not being the majority party. Why do you think it was that Newt Gingrich, with his leadership, his vision, his contract with America, took Republicans over the finish line and brought them to the majority party?
So what Jeff and I argue in the book, we sort of argue a little bit about against conventional wisdom, because the conventional wisdom is that contract delivered them a majority. And that is a contribution Gingrich made, is that he's that created a lesson. Members of Congress are always looking at elections, looking for a lesson, and that was the lesson they got. But actually, in fact, the contract was not that well known. Polls showed that majority of Americans didn't even know about it. It wasn't really affecting a lot of voters. What was happening, though, at the time was a number of things, some of which Gingrich was responsible for, helped with, some were not. One of them was, frankly, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was not popular, and he was a lead weight, just pulling down Democrats that year. So there was partly a kind of reaction against Clinton that was helping Republicans across the board. Another thing, though, that was happening was that, and I should say, sort of to note this, that we didn't know until we did the research for this book, is that there were folks with poll data in early 1994 in the Republican Party that was showing they were going to do well, and they were kind of keeping it under their lid. They keep it on their hat. They didn't want to, get people's hopes up, but they were seeing in early 1994, well before the contract, that things were going well for the Republican Party. What, though, Gingrich and other Republicans did to help that process, besides this general kind of anti-Clinton, and also, I should note one other thing, which is the realignment of the South. Yep. So the South was voting, it seems funny now, right? What, the South voted Democrat? Yes, it was a Democratic stronghold for many, many years. But finally, in the early 90s, it was starting to, the conservatism of the South was starting to match with the Republican Party. So conservatives were willing to vote Republican as opposed to saying, "Oh, I'm not going to vote Republican," right? But one of the other things that Gingrich and his allies were doing, fundraising. lots of fundraising. Bill Paxton, who became the head of the NRCC, he took the NRCC, which was kind of a mess, and turned it around financially.
Explain what the NRCC is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The National Republican Campaign Committee. So it's basically the campaign arm of the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. They're in charge of raising money, helping recruit candidates, train candidates, et cetera. Bill Paxton came in, this congressman from New York, and said, well, I think they had a deficit. It was just a mess. And
it was a disaster.
Yeah, and he turned it around, and it became a very powerful and successful organization at just the right time. Gingrich was also, and had been for some time, working on recruiting strong candidates for office, strong Republicans running for office. He'd been doing this for years. He had these audio tapes he would send out. Well, yes, and we can talk more about that, but he had these audio tapes he would send out. He had his own organization, GoPac, that was doing this. And these audio tapes, I know this, again, it sounds like ancient history, audio tapes, right? I mean, what are you talking about? But, this is before, before contemporary technology. You were a state lawmaker and you get this tape from someone in Georgia, from Congress, and you put it in, and he's talking about, these are the 5 ways of changing the world, and we're going to do this and this. And it inspired a lot of Republicans to run for office, including someone by the name of John Boehner, who later became Speaker of the House and was part of the leadership team for Gingrich. So Gingrich is doing campaign recruitment. He's doing fundraising. He is also, in addition to all that, being pretty strategic about when to cooperate with Democrats in the House and when to obstruct them. So without going into details, there was this big fiasco the Democrats had in 1994 over a crime bill. And the Republicans basically said, we're not going to work with Democrats on this at all. And Democrats said, not even some of the moderates? No, you got to get all your votes from your own party, knowing that that would strain the Democratic Party because it had factions. And sure enough, they failed to pass what's called the rule, which is the procedures for enacting the crime bill, which again seems like procedural trivia, but it was completely unexpected and it got national news. So here again, Democrats fail is the national news. It was very demoralizing for the Democratic Party. And it sent a signal that, maybe this party shouldn't govern if they don't know how to actually pass major bills. So a combination of fundraising, campaign, candidate recruitment and training, obstruction, and strategic obstruction, sometimes working with Democrats, sometimes not, plus the contracts are things that, along with those big national macro factors, propelled the Republicans to the majority in 1994.
So here's where I got in trouble. So I was the youngest legislative director in the House on the Republican side once we took over. And I said to my boss, John Kasich, the crime bill that you just mentioned, John, you have to vote for this. You have to vote for it. The mail is coming in. The phone calls are coming in. You got to vote for this. And Speaker Gingrich was, let me just politely say, so pissed off that a member of his leadership team, and what his premium was on loyalty, would consider as a Republican voting for this. And I was like, oh, John, let's go through it. Do you need a bayonet? No. Do you need a pistol grip? No. Do you need a grenade launcher? No. And we went through all these things. And I said, this is not what your constituents want. So do you want to do what Newt wants? Or do you want to do what your constituents want? And that was, Matt, the hardest, I think, for working for him for almost 9 years, vote that he ever took, because Newt never forgave him for that. And I'd love for you to talk about your perspective about being a speaker and loyalty, particularly as it pertains to Newt Gingrich.
It's interesting you asked that question, because when I think loyalty and speaker, I usually actually think Nancy Pelosi, who's another speaker who puts a high premium on loyalty within her party and does not take kindly to folks who she sees as disloyal. So it's interesting to hear you say that about Gingrich and your old boss, and this is on the crime bill vote. You said, yeah. One of the things when you are a party leader, you do need loyalty, right? You got to count on those members to vote with you, to support you. You can't succeed as a leader in Congress if you don't have the votes, if your party's not with you. Look at look at England right now. Right? Look at the Tories, right? Total disaster. But how do you get that loyalty? How do you earn it? How do you keep it is the challenge. Getting back to the discussion, the thing I mentioned earlier about whips, right? That, oh, well, the whip is someone who's aggressive. And no, that's a terrible way to earn loyalty, in my opinion, because that just burns bridges. It makes people resentful. You don't want to force people to do things. You want them to agree. Steny Hoyer, the majority leader, called it the culture. Was it the culture of consensus or something of the consensus? Yeah. Where he wants you to get up in the morning and say, I'm going to be with the party today. So Steny doesn't have to call you. He doesn't have to whip you. It's just like, I'm just going to be with the party. So it's just hard to gain that and to keep it, particularly in a system where individuals are getting elected in their own districts or states. They're not getting as much help from the party as in other systems like parliamentary systems. So how do you get them to stick with you? And this was a problem. I think what Gingrich had initially, Jeff and I talk about in the book, is he had initially a speaker in 1995, this tremendous amount of loyalty because he had brought the Republicans the majority. He was the Moses who had brought them to the promised land. So with that, Gingrich had tremendous leeway. And some of the research we've done, research other political scientists have done, talk about some division in the party in early 1995. And Gingrich comes in and says, no, that we're going to do it this way. Oh, okay, we're going to do it this way. This is what Gingrich wants. But that only lasts you so long. And, as we talk about in the book, as more challenging issues come up, as the contract is over and the Republicans are looking for a new agenda, something new to enact, those fissures within the party are starting to emerge, and Gingrich struggles to keep his party unified, and ultimately has some very serious problems as a result.
And I can tell you, I mean, as you know, for having been there, I mean, yes, the ascendancy was remarkable, but that's why I think, in case you're wondering, it's called the rise and fall of a party entrepreneur. And I want to get to the fall part of it momentarily. But since this is our class, and since we talk about the American presidency, I'd love for you, Matt, to tell us what's your sense of the dynamic between two relatively young leaders in the form of Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton.
So we do talk about this in the book. It is a really fascinating relationship that the two have. I'm always interested in folks who have more insight into it. You may have more insight into it about this relationship that they have. But, Gingrich, when Clinton is elected, it's a unified Democratic majority. It's a unified Democratic government. Okay. And Gingrich is looking at Clinton and seeing someone certainly who's younger than the person that he beat, George H.W. Bush, someone who's politically savvy, but also Gingrich is thinking, at least our take on it is he's thinking, is this someone I can work with or not? You know what? I think this is somebody who could cause the Republicans a lot of problems. And I think ultimately it makes more sense not to cooperate. Now, Gingrich is not he doesn't come right out and say, I'll never work with you, right? He says, look, you're the president. We're going to work with you on areas where we agree. But I think in that initial kind of, there's sort of a back and forth between the two. Initially, Clinton maybe has more authority. He's the president. Gingrich, he's the whip. What does he know? But Gingrich is not afraid, along with his allies in the party, to challenge Clinton on his agenda, on what he's doing, to attack the president, where it's seen as strategic to do so. And then when 1994 comes around, suddenly everything is switched. Mm-hmm. And now Gingrich is ascendant, and all of a sudden it's Clinton who's on the defensive. Wait, now I can't remember. Didn't he say, I'm still relevant? Or yes, Clinton says, I'm still relevant.
Still relevant.
Yeah. If a leader has to say they're still relevant, they're not relevant. So that's a bad sign. And it's Gingrich and the House Republicans who have all the energy, passing these items in the contract, and the White House is like, what are we going to do? I mean, we can veto these things, but everyone's focused on Gingrich, and everyone's thinking this is where the center of government is. And Gingrich has this, this kind of advantage. But then, as I mentioned earlier, as the Republican Party starts to divide a little bit, they're getting into more difficult issues like spending on Medicare, Social Security.
Yep.
These things are getting close to the classic third rail of politics, right? You just don't touch it or you'll get electrocuted.
It gets zapped.
And you end up having this standoff with the Republicans, Bob Dole, who's the Senate Majority Leader, and Newt Gingrich on one side, and Clinton on the other. And Clinton ultimately uses this, I guess it was Dick Morris, right? This triangulation strategy where Clinton says, I'll work with Dole against Clinton, or against Gingrich. I'll work with Gingrich against Dole. He's sort of playing them off each other because they don't actually get along all that well. And he also, Clinton realizes, I've got the bully pulpit. So there's actually 2 shutdowns. There's government shutdowns over this. And the Republicans are saying it's Clinton's fault. We gave him a nice spending bill. He vetoed it. He's being stubborn. It's his fault. The government isn't working. And Clinton just goes on national TV and just says, nope, it's the Republicans. What's changed? I've been president for 3 years. No shutdowns my first 2. Now we have Republicans and we have shutdowns. I wonder who's to blame. And, I'm summarizing a lot of detailed history here, but in a nutshell, Gingrich and Republicans Gingrich particularly has to back off. And once that happens, now we see that, Clinton has sort of reasserted himself and Gingrich is on the defensive.
So I have to share with you, I was 24 years old. I was 24 years old in leadership meeting, sitting behind my boss, government shutdown. And I said, Bill Clinton's going to clean our clock. And Newt was like, what did you say, young man? I was like, Mr. Speaker, he's going to clean our clock. What are you talking about? I said, they're going to put folks out, and you know it well, out at the Smithsonian, out at everything that you want to come to Washington, D.C. to see, that they had Al Gore, they had you fill in the blanks of your cabinet officer, and they're going to say, this is what the Republicans did. And, this mouthy 24-year-old, because what the hell do I know, right? But it's interesting, and it's a nice pivot point for me to ask you this. For the brilliance of Newt Gingrich, I think he had a lot of blind spots in the way that he approached policy and implementation. And so I'd love to ask you, Matt, what do you think his greatest strengths and greatest weaknesses were as a leader?
Well, first, I want to say I think the Republicans wish in retrospect they had listened to you a little more carefully in that leadership.
I was 24 years old. What the hell do I know?
Well, you got to listen to young, you can't let age, but, and these folks have been young themselves. They should have listened. But anyway, they learned the hard way. So his blind spots and his strengths. I'll start with the strengths. So, we talk about some of these in the book. Gingrich's strengths included, first of all, tenacity. I mean, he was talking about Republicans taking back the House from the moment, even before he was first elected to the House in 1978, which at that point, it had been 64, 74, like 25 years. The Republicans had been in the minority. And he's coming in saying, we're going to take back the majority. It's like, what are you talking about? You go forward 15 years, he's still talking about it. He is not giving up. This is his goal, and he is not going to give it up. There were times we talk about in the book where he had second thoughts. He thought, I'm getting a lot of criticism for this. I'm now a public figure. I'm a target. But he would get back on that horse and keep doing it. And to the extent that is a useful skill in certain circumstances, I think that was that is a good example of a skill he had as a leader. Related to that is vision. I mean, his tenacity was related to his vision. I want the Republicans to be in the majority. And after every election, he'd say, we're going to do it in the next 2 years, right? This is my vision. And, sometimes you need that. When you're in the minority, you need someone to say, this is how we're going to get there. And this is how we're going to do it. And this is why it's important. So I think that was an important skill. He has charisma. It's an interesting, it makes him a puzzle. And I think, why some folks write about him as sort of an unknown or enigma is because he wasn't your typical member of Congress, right? Like your typical member of Congress is charismatic and may talk about things in a fairly straightforward way about, kitchen table issues. And here's Gingrich, and we have a picture in the book of drawing these diagrams with these circles that look like footballs and all these arrows going everywhere, and the 5 transformations and the triangle. And and for some members, they just said, no, that's not for me. But for a lot of them, they said, wow, this is really interesting. And he was a historian by trade. So he would, talk about history, you talk about great figures in world history. He was educated. And so there was that, it's just unusual to have that combination. The other thing I'd say was a skill, which many think was a bad thing about him. He did have oratorical skills, particularly in criticizing the other party, sound bites. He would get on the floor and he would talk, and Democrats would it was like fingernails on a chalkboard, right? Oh, he's driving us nuts. It's just like the way he talked, the things he pointed out, the terms he used was designed to kind of poke at Democrats and summarize things and say things in these sound bites that would be annoying to Democrats, like the most corrupt party ever, mafia-like, just the stuff he would use to describe Democrats. But it was really appealing to a lot of Republicans, both in and out of Congress. So I think that those are some of the skills that we identify.
And let's go back, because I think I would love to share with you all that Matt knows as well as I know, for having been on the Hill at the time, of what a transformational leader he was, of the stupid little things like these audio tapes, right? I mean, who the heck? I mean, he would send these tapes to current members of Congress, to aspiring members of Congress, and say, this is what we're going to do. This is who we are. Explain from your perspective of why you think that was so transformational.
Well, part of, just in general, part of the things that made Gingrich, an unusual leader is that he did love technology, and he loved communication technology. He was always trying to find the latest technology that he could use. So the idea of, the audio tapes weren't new, but the idea of having a recording of yourself that you could then send out, and it would be the same recording going to hundreds of people. Now that's called Twitter or Instagram, right? But then it was like, well, wow. So you're reaching all these people once with the same message. He also was doing some television work, which doesn't get as much attention, but he was trying to, kind of create these televised lessons that would then kind of be sent out either through satellite or just being mailed, that would have, again, like a message that was getting to people. So, part of that, that audio tape story is really, I think, about technology, and his desire to use new technologies to reach people and to achieve one of his goals, which is a governing Republican Party in the House of Representatives. But it's also related to his rhetoric and his vision. I mean, he wasn't sending tapes saying, "Hi, I'm Newt Gingrich. I'd like you to run for Congress." It was these tapes that just had, these broad, messages, and saying, here is how we are going to bring about a conservative transformation of society. Right? We're going to do all these things, which was news to a lot of people getting these tapes. And that was, by the way, and I should note, he wasn't just about a majority party in the House. One of the things that Jeff and I argue is that he also genuinely believed in this conservative transformation of society. He didn't necessarily get it, but it was part and parcel. It was this idea that I don't just want a majority party. I want our society to be fundamentally conservative, because it is too liberal. It's the New Deal society going on forever, and it's time to fundamentally transform it. And so these tapes and this technology was also a way for him to try to achieve that goal.
So he was a great leader to bring the Republicans to the promised land. But do you think he was an effective Speaker of the House of Representatives?
Well, we have 2 chapters in the book dedicated to his.
I've read your book, but I'm just.
And I'm just saying. And we have the first chapter, which I believe is Promises and Pitfalls, right? And then the second chapter is basically a failed speakership. So if you were to take, and this is why sometimes it's hard to rate speakers. Sometimes people say, well, who's the greatest speaker? Who's the weakest speaker? Who was it? Well, with Gingrich's, you've got to, if you took from January of 1995 to mid-April 1995, I think he would probably be top 10, top 5, at least in the modern era. Yep. Whether you liked what he did or not, incredibly effective. They're passing all these bills in 100 days, which is mimicking the New Deal, but that had never been done in Congress. Presidents in 100 days, sure, right? Executive orders, whatever. Congress in 100 days, getting bills through committees. I mean, you were on the, you saw it, I'm sure, better than I did, but just how fast that was, how exhausting it was.
Oh, we didn't sleep for 100 days.
And yet, with Gingrich's leadership and help of others, they pulled it off. So that is absolutely tremendous, right? But then you go from, April on, and particularly from like September, October, the fiscal year is over, you have the shutdowns that are happening. Now Gingrich's speakership is looking more tarnished. And then in his second and final term as speaker, where, Republicans still keep the House, but they lost some seats. Clinton was reelected. There's a little bit of disgruntlement there about Gingrich. He has to kind of whip his party to get enough votes to be elected speaker. There's still a lot of unhappiness with Gingrich, not only because of the shutdowns, but also a sense that he is not providing the direction the party needs. Was very good in the minority, right? This is the promised land. This is how we're going to get here. Yep. Speaker is a different thing. You got to build coalitions. You got to do trade-offs. You've got to negotiate more. You've got to actually produce. And this became more of a struggle for Gingrich as his party was divided and he had trouble keeping the party together. And then the elections aren't going so well. Republicans would lose seats. Well, I thought this was the person who could gain us seats. And then, and the other thing that's happening too is his ability to communicate with other Republicans in Congress is either was always not good or it just got worse. But he's saying things like, all right, well, 1997, okay, so we're going to have to balance the budget. So let's just put tax cuts aside for a minute. Republicans say, I'm sorry, what did you say? You're going to put tax cut? Are we not the party of low taxes? This kind of, these misspeak is, he's changing he's saying members one thing and then he says the opposite. It's starting to make Republicans think that this person is not a good leader. He's not providing leadership. And so you end up with this coup attempt in mid-1997 where a cabal of freshman members and other members of the leadership team in the Republican Party talk seriously about overthrowing Gingrich.
Which is extraordinary.
Right. That just doesn't happen. And it didn't happen. But, again, I mentioned what's happening in the Tory party in England right now. Something similar to that. The headlines are Republicans in disarray, fighting amongst themselves, trying to kick out Gingrich. Who's in charge? This kind of stuff. And, Democrats are sitting back saying, this is nice to watch. But it also means, it's a practical matter, the speakership is weak. Speaker is weak. The party doesn't have direction. And these are in no small part due to some flaws that Gingrich has, his inability to communicate with the party consistently, the inability to kind of keep a coalition together, an inability to have a real strong platform after the contract, and also difficulty of governing in a divided government. You got to deal with Clinton.
Yeah, and so 2 points to that. So one, everyone says, oh, Reagan and Tip O'Neill, and we see Gingrich and Bill Clinton. But who do you think won those battles? Because I can certainly tell you who I think won those battles because I was sitting there watching it. I think Bill Clinton cleaned our clock, right? Newt was the great guy to take us to the promised land, but I thought that Bill Clinton was the great tactician of making the Republicans look bad. What's your take on the dynamic between that president and that speaker?
Between Clinton and Gingrich? Well, I agree with that take completely. I will say in defense of Gingrich and Republicans that, and this came through in some of the interviews we did for the book, that the Republican victory in 1994 moved Clinton to the middle or to the right. That, he was, and it's because he's a tactician, right? He's a shift over here, shift over here. So Republicans take control of the House of Representatives in 1994 or 1995 technically. And, there's these battles between Gingrich and Republicans on the one side, Clinton, Dole and Clinton on the other. But at the same time, what do you have? You have welfare reform. You have a fundamental transformation of the national welfare system, which Clinton, had kind of maybe hinted at before, but it's Republicans that are driving that train after the 1994 election. And there's, I think 1 or 2 times it was vetoed. I can't remember. And ultimately it was twice vetoed and then it was signed into law. And Democrats are so demoralized. I thought we were the party of, the government sort of providing assistance to those in need. And you've transformed welfare to a system where states have more power, where it's easier to get cut off welfare. There's all these, there's more tests that you need to do. I make it sound like it was pretty picky and stuff, but really it was changing it from an entitlement program, which is you qualify, you get the money, to, well, you qualify, but you need to do these things, or you only get it for so long. And that is a major, major bill. And that is the Republicans' agenda, and Clinton signs it into law. So there were legislative successes that were due, I would argue, at least in part, to the Republicans taking over the House and Senate, and Clinton saying, okay, I'll give somewhat, at least, on these things.
And I can certainly tell you from my perspective, for having, been working for the House Budget Committee Chairman John Kasich, that you're exactly right? Is it 5 years? Is it 7 years? How are we going to balance the budget? How are we going to do this? But the fact that the Republicans had that majority, at least had to bring the president to the table to negotiate, where, as we've discussed, they run the roost for 40 years. So let me go back to, we've talked about the arc, we've talked about the transformation of Newt Gingrich. What do you think brought him down?
Brought down Newt Gingrich? Well, there's these things that we've talked about already, the flaws that he had, the weaknesses that he had, the sort of loss of his prestige as he was making mistakes, tactical mistakes. What ultimately brought him down, though, was the 1998 election. Now, there's something before that, which is Bill Clinton and impeachment, which is starting in the fall of 1998. And there's some tactical mistakes Gingrich makes there as well, because it's a delicate issue, right? How do you deal with a president who's, committed possibly crimes, possibly not, but it involves a relationship with an intern, so there's a prurient interest to it. It's a delicate matter to handle. But what happens in 1998 is that this is a midterm election with a Democrat in the White House. So traditionally, the president's party loses seats. In fact, that's happened every time since the New Deal, with the exception of 1934, and it happens in 1998.
Well, and us, in Bush for his midterm.
In 1990?
No, Bush 43.
Oh, yeah, I'm thinking up to that point. Yeah,
sorry.
yes, I'm sorry. Yes, it's happened since then. But in 1998, it only happened once, which was 1934. And so, and people say, 1984, right? Everyone loves FDR. It's a New Deal. Well, it's 1998. Okay, there's this impeachment thing, but is it really going to help Democrats? I mean, Clinton's the one who's in trouble, and Republicans lose seats. They don't lose very many seats, but they lose seats. That's the opposite of what's supposed to happen. And again, as I said before, members of Congress, they look for lessons in elections. So what's the lesson of this one? Well, maybe we shouldn't pursue impeachment. That ultimately, that's not the lesson that they take, because they pursue it anyway. But the other lesson is, well, Gingrich, he's supposed to increase seat, and he's been a problem for us now for some time, and we're losing seats.
Yeah.
So Gingrich, if you're going to be Moses, you bring him to the promised land, but if you're a speaker, you got to keep bringing him to the promised land, and he's not doing it. And at this point, it seems to me, at least, from doing the research and from when I was on the Hill, actually, I was not on the Hill at that time, but there's so much erosion in Gingrich's base at that point that it doesn't take much. You lose a few seats, and then it just kind of starts to crumble. And so then you've got, unlike in 1996, when there's some disgruntlement, you actually have someone, Bob Livingston, the chairman of appropriations, saying, I'm going to run for speaker. And Gingrich is either going to get out of the way, or I'm going to run against him.
And tell us what happened with Bob Livingston.
Well, okay. So this was how crazy that time period was. Absolutely insane. So you have the election. Gingrich is in trouble. And he's trying to hang on for a little while, but they do the vote count and they say, Gingrich, you're not going to win the vote for speaker. It's like, okay, it's over for me. And Bob Livingston is going to be then the next speaker, because he's the appropriations chair. People like him. Actually, a good number of Democrats like him, even though he's very, very conservative. They respect him. They think this guy can get things done. We can work with him. He doesn't have the baggage that Gingrich did from all the things he'd done for us over the years. And this is this period where, I don't know how to put into words. It's like this fever of just, it's just everyone is, the Democrats are saying, oh, you're going to take on Newt Gingrich because he had an affair with an intern. Well, we're going to start taking you guys down because we know you had affairs. So all of a sudden, there's all these stories about other members having affairs. Not all that many other members, but one of them is, I think, Henry Hyde, chairman of the judiciary.
Yep.
Oh, yeah, he had an affair. And then Bob Livingston, it turns out he had also been unfaithful to his wife. And he goes to the House floor, and was it the debate on the impeachment?
Yeah, and this is the craziest thing. So I'm on the floor.
Oh, you were on the floor
with my boss, and they're all coming saying, Chairman Kasich, you have to be speaker, you have to be speaker. And Livingston is over in his corner, right? Because he was going to be the guy. And you're right. Everybody had had an affair. And I said, John, you don't, let me politely say this. You don't want to go down that road, is what I said to my boss.
Yeah.
But it was a fascinating time and turn to be on the House floor of all these members of Congress. You should be speaker. You should be speaker. You should be speaker. And
And so what happens? So this is this Puritan kind of this fever where everyone's pointing fingers at everybody else.
Yes.
We're just going to get you, right? You're going to get Clinton. We're going to get you. It was almost like visceral. And so Bob Livingston comes to the floor to give a speech, and people are thinking, okay, so he's going to, calm everybody down, or he's going to speak on behalf of impeachment. He's a partisan, fine. And he gets on the floor and he gives a speech that says, I got to leave Congress.
Yep.
I can't be speaker. I'm out.
Out.
And everyone is shocked. I think if I remember correctly from reading this, Richard Gephardt, who is then the leader of the Democrats in the House, comes up to him and says, what are you doing? Don't do this. He's like, no, because I've got baggage, and I can't, if I'm going to impeach the president in part because he lied over an affair, I can't then in good conscience run for speaker because I have baggage as well. Which was just a shocking moment.
His peace out moment. Which was just
peace out.
And it was insane. But of course, Bob Livingston was making boatloads of cash for founding the Livingston Group because, whatever retiring members do, they go off and make money.
Can I just ask you? You were on the floor. I was watching on C-SPAN, and I was, it was in my graduate student dorm, and no one there knew what was going on. I'm like, no one's caring. But on the floor, was it just, what was the reaction?
Oh, it was insane because we thought Livingston was going to be the next speaker, right? We were convinced that Bob Livingston, Louisiana, nice guy, Southerner, cool dude. And the next thing you know, we're like, wait, what did he just say? And we're like, holy bleep. And then everyone came running to my boss, like, you should be the next speaker. And he's like, nope, don't want it. But the fever, I think, is the best word that you used, because there was this fever, there was this intense uncertainty about what to do next. And they did not know what to do next. And I just thought, I'm a staffer and I'm just going to go hide in the corner, which is pretty much what I did. So talk to us about, you all have questions, right?
I hope you do.
Don't give me that look. You've heard so much about executive orders. You've heard so much about interplay between Article 1, Article 2. So there's going to be some trouble if there aren't questions for our guest speaker tonight. I'm just saying this right now. So that being said, talk to us post Newt Gingrich. What did the Gingrich era usher in that we can attribute, but for, I'm a lawyer, I can't help it, but for Newt Gingrich, that perhaps the House of Representatives is running in the manner that it is now, that it wouldn't be running the way that it is, but for Newt Gingrich?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the reasons I think it's such an important question is that people to this day are still talking about the influence that Gingrich had. And a lot of that, I think it's safe to say Jeff and I disagree with, because people look at things they don't like in politics and they try to look for the person who's responsible. And they'll often say, it's Gingrich, right? We have Trump because of Gingrich. We have angry tweets because of Gingrich. We have people yelling at each other because of Gingrich. We have Marjorie Taylor Greene because of Gingrich. What we talk about in the book is we say, look, this is what we would argue based on the evidence that we have seen. Gingrich's primary influence was within Congress. It's how members of, and there's several aspects to this. So part of it is just the greater centralization. of power in the House. Now that started before Gingrich. It goes back as far as Carl Albert, who's a speaker in the 70s. It got more so with Tip O'Neill and then Jim Wright. But it was Gingrich who sort of came in and said, this is a transformative moment, and we're going to change the way the House is structured. We're going to get rid of a lot of the things that Democrats had to basically help themselves get reelected. You had this printing room in the basement. I remember this thing. So members of Congress, this is again before the internet. How do you reach someone? You send out mail. So you have the mail room and you've got this giant printing thing, and you just send your mail down there. You send your newsletters out, gets printed free of charge. Well, taxpayers are paying for it, I guess.
It's called, explain to them what the franking privilege is. The
franking privilege is a privilege that lawmakers have where instead of a stamp, they can just sign their name on the corner of an envelope. And that's the postage. So members of Congress, of course, like to use that to communicate to their constituents so they stay in their, on their radar and helps them get reelected. So Gingrich saw this as basically a tool that had been used for Democrats to solidify their majority despite what a lot of voters wanted. So there's a lot of reforms that are going on internally in the House. And I remember, because I was there at the time, I remember how much things changed in terms of the way you could do things. So before it was sort of, if you were a Democrat and you needed a new carpet or you needed something, you just sort of call your friend over in House administration. You say, oh, here's some furniture. Oh yeah, sure. No one's keeping track of any spending, you just get whatever you need. And then Gingrich comes in and they do an audit of the House, and it was Price Waterhouse or something. And they were like, wow, what a mess. There's no one's keeping track of the books. This is totally inefficient. So it becomes more professionalized. I think that's one of the understated contributions of Gingrich and his allies was to professionalize the House. Say, if you want something, you got to have the money for it. You don't have the money, you can't have it. Also, though, centralizing power. So leaders have more power over who committee chairs are, who's on committees. This is what we still have to this day. That's another contribution. I think another contribution, though, to get back to this message, the sort of learning from past behavior or past events or elections is Democrats looking at Republicans in 1995 and saying they got power because of the things that Gingrich did. Contract with America, being a team, thinking of your party as a team, yeah. Not being afraid to use obstruction, doing a lot of communication, messaging, sometimes more than legislating. And, again, some of that was already happening before, but I would say that accelerated greatly under Gingrich. And so today you see a lot of members who focus on messaging. Madison Cawthorn said famously or infamously, my staff do they do communications. They don't really legislate. Okay, but you're a lawmaker, but all right. Yeah. One other legacy I should note, which is a negative one, is that there were big cuts in staff. And the idea was you want to cut spending in Congress. It's inefficient, and also you want to serve as an example to the country. We can cut. But some of those staff were really important to help Congress do its job and do it well. And I think that hurts, that frankly, I'm going to opinionate here. I think that hurts both parties. I think it hurt Gingrich, it hurts Democrats. There's nothing wrong with having a strong set of staff, particularly when you're dealing with a strong executive that has a lot of staff at their disposal. And those cuts arguably really hurt Congress's ability to legislate and to be an independent branch of government.
So for us being former staffers, of course, you and I 100% agree with that. but you bring up a really important aspect of the Gingrich speakership, which was demonizing Washington, right? Don't stay here, don't be here, don't be a creature of this. Do you think that his efforts when he became speaker in 1995 have sort of led to the polarization that we see now of like the hell with Washington and, off with their hats?
I think there's so many factors that have contributed to that polarization that I'd be hesitant to give Gingrich too much credit. I do think that he was an important influence on members of Congress thinking that way. And, I don't know if it's still happening that much, but this trend of members sleeping in their offices.
Which is so weird.
Can you imagine if you all had to sleep in your classrooms, right? It'd be kind of strange. That's what, and part of it was saving money, but part of it was I'm definitely not a creature of Washington. I come here to come to my office. I'm going to stay in here. And as soon as I can, I'm going to get out of here and go home where I belong. that kind of attitude, that sort of rhetoric, Gingrich might have helped kind of popularize or make more widespread. But we have a long tradition in this country of kind of anti-Washington, anti-centralized power, going back to to the revolution, really. And so there's always been an undercurrent of that. Maybe Gingrich was very good at popularizing it at that time, and sort of creating a message of, Washington, hostile, Democrats, corrupt kind of thing. But in some ways, you could argue that he kind of tapped into what was already there. He just found a way to kind of express it that got a lot of attention.
So a few more questions before you will ask questions of our speaker. Just pointing this out in advance. So Nancy Pelosi, did Nancy Pelosi watch Newt Gingrich and take a page out of his book and say, you know what, I'm going to have a centralized structure of leadership, committee chairs. We do everything from the speaker's office, and we're going to do it from my suite, versus allowing the House really to do its will? Do you think she learned that from him?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I think it would be
I don't
wonderful.
know either, but I had to ask you.
Yeah, I know. And I wish, and that's a good question. I would love to have some sort of bizarre time machine where I could mix everything up and have Pelosi be speaker in, like 1987 or something like that, and see what she would do then. Because, part of it, I'm tempted to say yes, right? That she was a minority. She was in the minority when Gingrich was speaker. She's watching how he's operating, how he's able to centralize power in the ways that can be effective. On the other hand, you can't just sort of mimic that, right? It's got to be something about you as a person or a leader. You have to be comfortable with that. So I would be hesitant to say that she, just learned that from Gingrich, so much as it's also, if not instead, a function of the way she prefers to lead, how she wants to be speaker. Yep. Because we can think about other folks who've come after Gingrich who don't, they don't centralize as much. Dennis Hastert, his style was much more hands-off, for example. Kevin McCarthy will be really interesting to watch, because I don't think he is of the same cloth as Gingrich or Pelosi.
No.
So how he's going to keep that party together, I don't know, but I don't see him being the kind of leader, yeah. So, so in other words, it's not that when Gingrich did it, every other speaker did it. There also has to be the individual as a variable.
So from one author to another, I have to ask this question. What was the most interesting, intriguing, surprising thing when you and your colleague wrote this book that you can share with the class?
That I can share with the class is the key modifier to that sentence.
Of course.
So I think a couple of things. So one I already mentioned, which is these memos. So the Gingrich papers, which we were very fortunate to have access to, this is his archives, hundreds and hundreds of boxes of papers. And he was very prolific. And we're finding all of these fascinating, detailed memos he's writing to staff are writing to him. He's writing about the vision of the future, all these things. Really gave us some insight into the way Gingrich's mind works. The other thing I'll mention, which was I guess it's a couple more, but I'll mention one more, which is which I did not know about. So after 1980, Republicans gain seats in the House. They don't have a majority. Tip O'Neill is Speaker of the House. Reagan is the president, right? And Republicans have won the Senate. But the Republicans are still the minority in the House. So what are you going to do? Well, Gingrich, in part inspired by what's happening in state legislatures, says, I know what we'll do. We'll convince Democrats who are conservative to vote with us on the floor for speaker. And we'll have a bipartisan coalition. We'll kick out O'Neill and we'll get somebody else. Like, there was a congressman named Sonny Montgomery, a conservative Democrat. We'll make him speaker.
Sonny Montgomery.
Yes, GV Sonny Montgomery. We'll make him speaker. This is a really audacious thing for a second term member of Congress to do, is to kick out the existing speaker and replace them with a bipartisan coalition. And he composes this list we found. It's called the Dirty 30. These are the folks who are going to defect and vote for the Republican. He's got their names. He's got the committees they're going to get. He's thought this out. It ends up dying in part because O'Neill realizes he's in trouble and he goes to his party and says, "Don't you dare defect." But it was a really, I just didn't know about this. It was really fascinating to Jeff and I about that Gingrich at this early stage is already thinking, how can I get the Republicans in power? I'm willing to take on the Speaker of the House to do it.
I see my dear friend Tom McIntyre, who resides on the third floor here, who hopefully you all have had the chance to meet him and hang out with him. Cool dude. Are you giving me the hook? How much time do I have? Couple of questions from the students. So at this juncture, let me stop talking and open the floor up to the class and hear what's on your mind. And I will yield my microphone to you.
What are sort of some of the similarities and differences from how Gingrich took the 1997 impeachment vote and decided to go gung ho with that versus what you saw in the last presidency with Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats? Do you think they were more adamant about that vote compared to what happened in 1997 or 1997, 98, 97? Or what were they similar, different? Can you just elaborate on that?
Well, that could be a whole dissertation right there. Just a couple quick things that come to mind. I think, obviously you've got two fundamentally different situations. One is involving, basically it's a sex scandal, and the other is involving national security. I'm talking about the first impeachment now, not the second one. So the dynamics are different. The Clinton one is a more perilous one because in some ways it plays well with the public. People understand it. On the other hand, it taps into, it can go in strange directions. We talked about this fever between the two, that was going on because of this, talking about, affairs and things like that. It gets very lurid. I think that, what we argue in the book is that Gingrich was actually more careful about impeachment than people realize because he was worried about whether or not this might go off the rails or go in some strange direction. There were other members of Congress like Tom DeLay from Texas who were really pushing this hard, and Gingrich was not doing enough to kind of rein them in or direct them. With Pelosi, my understanding is that she was much more careful about impeachment. Maybe she had learned from Gingrich and said, you can't just jump into this. It'll be labeled as partisan, and then it's a pointless exercise. It still became partisan, and maybe it wasn't. There was no point to it. I don't know. But I think that I think the differences to me outweigh the similarities in terms of what the scandal was and then how it was managed by the respective speakers.
Yeah. Other questions? See, I'm doing Oprah style now. Now I'm roaming around up.
So you talked a lot about Gingrich being a very effective leader or Speaker of the House. Do you feel like that can ever be replicated by somebody else in the future?
It would be hard to replicate Gingrich because just period, right? But in particular, because again, the Republicans have been out of power for 40 years. So, Pelosi, Democrats take over the House in 2006, Republicans take over the House in 2010. They're not waiting that long to be in the majority. But with Gingrich, that length of time means he has got a degree of power and unity that is extremely rare. So that alone makes him hard to replicate. But I think also he was doing some things that at the time seemed fairly new. His communication technology, his communication style, his willingness to kind of go for the jugular with Democrats or his enemies, which sometimes were Republicans. But now you just see that. I mean, there was a study I was just reading, a recent article about incivility in tweets by members of Congress, which tripled and quadruples after the 2016 election. And so now it's all kinds of people saying, bleep you bleep and bleep, right? I was like, I mean, even Gingrich didn't do that, right? It's just like the quality of the rhetoric has dropped. And so, I don't know what it would take for someone to be, I guess maybe someone like Trump, right? To do something and say something that people had not heard before, but it's just very hard. So I would say it would take a lot of unusual circumstances to see someone like Gingrich in power doing the things he did and the way he did them.
And let me underscore your point, because it's so important for you all to hear this. We'd never seen or done this before as Republicans, right? We've been in the wilderness for 40 years. And here comes this bomb thrower who's doing what he's doing and saying what he's saying in a way that we'd never, as staffers, as members, had never seen before. Questions on this side of the room? All right, coming. Tom, how much time do I have? Okay.
I just had a question about how you think Newt Gingrich would have handled some of that political polarization that did come up during the Trump administration and even just slightly before, as the Obama administration was transitioning out. Just considering the way that the Republican Party has sort of shifted. I know you mentioned that he was still very big on the fact that the country as a whole needs to move in a more conservative direction. But I'm curious what you think, specifically on the Republican and conservative side, what Gingrich would have done with that sort of political polarization and how he would have handled what the idea of a conservative looks like versus what actually transpired.
It's a good question because one of the things Gingrich, and we talk about this at the end of the book, I mean, he really attached himself to Trump. He wrote the first book, biography of Trump. He was advising Trump. He was talking up Trump in the 2016 election. So, that might lead one to think, oh, well, if he were in Congress, he would have done the same thing. And also polarization. I mean, he saw that Democrats were winning votes from people who should have voted Republican. So for him, differentiating the parties, i.e. polarization, was a good thing because it would help the Republicans and help voters know which side, there's clear distinctions between the parties. So again, you'd think, well, Gingrich would have supported this. But if Gingrich had been in Congress and had been speaker, thinking back to other times that he was in the party when a Republican was in the White House, whether he was a speaker, well, he was never speaker with a Republican in the White House, but when he was in Congress, he wasn't always that loyal to Republican presidents.
No, he was not.
He challenged Reagan on multiple occasions. He famously challenged Bush in 1990 and basically said Bush has reached this agreement with Democrats to raise taxes over, I won't support it. And it failed, which was very embarrassing to the Bush White House. So my sense would be that Gingrich would look first and foremost at the Republican Party in the House. Say, is Trump helping this? Is he helping us? Fine. But if he's not, then I will not be afraid to stand up and say, you're not helping. You're not a true conservative. You're not achieving the objectives that we want to achieve. So that would be, this is a historical counterfactual, but that would be my guess as to how he would deal with a Trump White House if he were in Congress.
And interesting how Gingrich became so Trumpian, and miraculously, his wife became the ambassador to the Holy See at the Vatican, right? Funny how that works. Time for one last question. There's got to be one more. Oh.
In your kind of study of Gingrich and how he interacted with Clinton, do you think that which branch would you say is most important in that power dynamic, between the bully pulpit and control over the House?
We talk about this in the book. Those first 4 months or so, it's as if the House of Representatives is the center of government.
Yes.
The Senate isn't really driving the train and the president is being defensive. And this is such an interest, congressional scholar, I love Congress. Article 1, right? Congress should be more important and more powerful than it is. And so Gingrich doing this is like, okay, Congress is finally, grabbing back some of the powers that have been given to the president. But one could argue kind of tragedy by overextending themselves. House Republicans, especially Gingrich, are pushing the boundaries to the point that the president pushes back. And the president has so many resources at his disposal, and the bully pulpit is a huge one. And so, Gingrich, for all the attention he was getting, it's very hard for the press to cover 435 members and 100 in the Senate. But the president is just one person and can just get media coverage like that. At least back then he could. So I think that, that dynamic for a time was kind of Congress in some ways retaking the initiative. But I would say that by 1990, early 1996, it's kind of lost. And I'm not sure it's ever really come back again.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And that is why this book is called The Rise and Fall of a Party Entrepreneur, because you had someone who was sitting on the backbenches for so long, who finally made it to the promised land, who even after a couple years of being speaker was already on the downslope, which from me, from watching as a young Hill staffer, is like, I can't believe this guy's crashed and burned as quickly as he did. So let me just say this. You have had a treat tonight. I have had a treat tonight. I hope you have had a treat tonight. This book is fabulous. Matt did a great job with he and his colleague of really peeling back the onion of what I would call an enigma of American politics.